had a different aspect, and when Adonbec said to him, "Thou must tarry close by my side," he answered solemnly in the negative. "Yonder," he said, "are my comrades in arms, the men in whose society I have vowed to fight or fall. On their banner gleams the sign of our most blessed redemption. I cannot fly from the cross in company with the crescent." "Fool!" said the Hakim, "their first action will be to do thee to death, were it only to conceal their breach of the truce." "Of that I must take my chance," replied Sir Kenneth; "but I wear not the bonds of the infidels an instant longer than I can cast them from me." "Then I will compel thee to follow me," said El Hakim. "Compel!" answered Sir Kenneth angrily. "Wert thou not my benefactor, or one who has showed will to be such, and were it not that it is to thy confidence I owe the freedom of these hands, which thou mightest have loaded with fetters, I would show thee that, unarmed as I am, compulsion would be no easy task." "Enough, enough," replied the Arabian physician. "We lose time, even when it is becoming precious." So saying, he threw his arm aloft, and uttered a loud and shrill cry as a signal to his retinue, who instantly dispersed themselves on the face of the desert in as many different directions as a chaplet of beads when the string is broken. Sir Kenneth had no time to note what ensued, for, at the same instant, the Hakim seized the rein of his steed, and putting his own to its mettle, both sprung forth at once with the suddenness of light, and at a pitch of velocity which almost deprived the Scottish knight of the power of respiration, and left him absolutely incapable, had he been desirous, to have checked the career of his guide. Practised as Sir Kenneth was in horsemanship from his earliest youth, the speediest horse he had ever mounted was a tortoise in comparison to those of the Arabian sage. They spurned the sand from behind them, they seemed to devour the desert before them. Miles flew away with minutes, and yet their strength seemed unabated, and their respiration as free as when they first started upon the wonderful race. The motion, too, as easy as it was swift, seemed more like flying through the air than riding on the earth, and was attended with no unpleasant sensation, save the awe naturally felt by one who is moving at such astonishing speed, and the difficulty of breathing occasioned by their passing through the air so rapidly. It was not until after an hour of this portentous motion, and when all human pursuit was far, far behind, that the Hakim at length relaxed his speed, and, slackening the pace of the horses into a hand gallop, began, in a voice as composed, and even as if he had been walking for the last hour, a descant upon the excellence of his coursers to the Scot, who, breathless, half blind, half deaf, and altogether giddy, from the rapidity of this singular ride, hardly comprehended the words which flowed so freely from his companion. "These horses," he said, "are of the breed called the Winged, equal in speed to aught excepting the Borak of the Prophet. They are fed on the golden barley of Yemen, mixed with spices, and a small portion of dried sheep's flesh. Kings have given provinces to possess them, and their age is active as their youth. Thou, Nazarene, art the first, save a true believer, that ever had beneath his loins one of this noble race, a gift of the Prophet himself to the blessed Ali, his kinsman and lieutenant, well called the Lion of God. Time lays his touch so lightly on these generous steeds, that the mare on which thou now sittest has seen 5 times 5 years pass over her, yet retains her pristine speed and vigour. Only that in the career the support of a bridle, managed by a hand more experienced than thine, hath now become necessary. May the Prophet be blessed, who hath bestowed on the true believers the means of advance and retreat, which causeth their iron-clothed enemies to be worn out with their own ponderous weight. How the horses of yonder dog Templars must have snorted and blown, when they had toiled fetlock deep in the desert for 1/20th part of the space which these brave steeds have left behind them, without one thick pant or drop of moisture upon their sleek and velvet coats!" The Scottish knight, who had now begun to recover his breath and powers of attention, could not help acknowledging in his heart the advantage possessed by these Eastern warriors in a race of animals, alike proper for advance or retreat, and so admirably adapted to the level and sandy deserts of Arabia and Syria. But he did not choose to augment the pride of the Moslem by acquiescing in his proud claim of superiority, and therefore suffered the conversation to drop, and, looking around him, could now, at the more moderate pace at which they moved, distinguish that he was in a country not unknown to him. The blighted borders and sullen waters of the Dead Sea, the ragged and precipitous chain of mountains arising on the left, the 2 or 3 palms clustered together, forming the single green speck on the bosom of the waste wilderness, objects which, once seen, were scarcely to be forgotten, showed to Sir Kenneth that they were approaching the fountain called the Diamond of the Desert, which had been the scene of his interview on a former occasion with the Saracen Emir Sheerkohf, or Ilderim. In a few minutes they checked their horses beside the spring, and the Hakim invited Sir Kenneth to descend from horseback and repose himself as in a place of safety. They unbridled their steeds, El Hakim observing that further care of them was unnecessary, since they would be speedily joined by some of the best mounted among his slaves, who would do what further was needful. "Meantime," he said, spreading some food on the grass, "eat and drink, and be not discouraged. Fortune may rise up or abase the ordinary mortal, but the sage and the soldier should have minds beyond her control." The Scottish knight endeavoured to testify his thanks by showing himself docile, but though he strove to eat out of complaisance, the singular contrast between his present situation and that which he had occupied on the same spot when the envoy of princes and the victor in combat came like a cloud over his mind, and fasting, lassitude, and fatigue oppressed his bodily powers. El Hakim exclaimed in hurried pulse, his red and inflamed eye, his heated hand, and his shortened respiration. "The mind," he said, "grows wise by watching, but her sister the body, of coarser materials, needs the support of repose. Thou must sleep, and that thou mayest do so to refreshment, thou must take a draught mingled with this elixir." He drew from his bosom a small crystal vial, cased in silver filigree work, and dropped into a little golden drinking cup a small portion of a dark-coloured fluid. "This," he said, "is one of those productions which Allah hath sent on earth for a blessing, though man's weakness and wickedness have sometimes converted it into a curse. It is powerful as the wine-cup of the Nazarene to drop the curtain on the sleepless eye, and to relieve the burden of the overloaded bosom; but, when applied to the purposes of indulgence and debauchery, it rends the nerves, destroys the strength, weakens the intellect, and undermines life. But fear not thou to use its virtues in the time of need, for the wise man warms him by the same firebrand with which the madman burneth the tent." Some preparation of opium seems to be intimated. "I have seen too much of thy skill, sage Hakim," said Sir Kenneth, "to debate thine hest," and swallowed the narcotic, mingled as it was with some water from the spring, then wrapped him in the haik, or Arab cloak, which had been fastened to his saddle pommel, and, according to the directions of the physician, stretched himself at ease in the shade to await the promised repose. Sleep came not at first, but in her stead a train of pleasing, yet not rousing or awakening sensations. A state ensued in which, still conscious of his own identity and his own condition, the knight felt enabled to consider them not only without alarm and sorrow, but as composedly as he might have viewed the story of his misfortunes acted upon a stage, or rather as a disembodied spirit might regard the transactions of its past existence. From this state of repose, amounting almost to apathy, respecting the past, his thoughts were carried forward to the future, which, in spite of all that existed,